Karl Becker, had spent 2 years defending the army's right to decide what weapons the army received. A general of artillery, head of the Ordnance Office, ballistics specialist, dean of the military technology faculty at Berlin's Technical University. By the spring of 1940, he was losing. Hitler had criticized him personally over the shortfall in munitions, and Göring's economic empire wanted procurement taken out of army hands and moved into its own. He had been under that pressure for months, and the German record is blunt about what it did to him. On the 8th of April, Becker took his own life in his house. The German reference literature records that officials of the Gestapo were present. The regime buried him 4 days later with a state funeral, recorded the cause as natural, and said nothing. The next morning, German troops landed in Norway. A month after that, the panzers crossed the Meuse, and 6 weeks into that campaign, France signed an armistice. Germany was standing at the peak of everything it would ever achieve, and it had already killed one of its own generals in an argument over who controlled the factories. 3 years later, the same argument would be about something Germany could not manufacture at all: men. By 1943, Germany was fielding 3 separate ground armies and running out of infantry at the same time. The newest of them was built out of men the army had already asked for by name. The picture of a single German war machine has a pedigree. The propaganda ministry in Berlin wanted one instrument to display, because a unified machine frightens people and a committee does not. And after the war, the surviving generals needed an army that had been professional and coherent right up until politics wrecked it, because that version left them standing on the right side of the wreckage. One thing to fix in place first: at the front, everybody took orders from army generals. SS divisions and Luftwaffe divisions were subordinated to Army Corps for operations and fought where the army told them to fight. The separation was upstream of the battlefield. Each of the 3 ran its own recruiting system, held its own claim on weapons production, and answered to its own political patron. 3 pipelines feeding one fractured front line. By the middle of 1942, the German army had taken more than 1 million casualties since crossing into the Soviet Union, and it was replacing fewer than half of them in the divisions that had lost them. A division that loses 4,000 men and receives 2,000 back cannot hold the ground it was given, and the ground does not shrink to match. So the army went looking for men in places it had left alone. It looked at the Navy, which had shore personnel it could spare. And it looked at the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe had men because Göring had spent 6 years building the largest ground organization of any air force on Earth. Anti-aircraft artillery, signals, airfield construction, servicing, administration. Hundreds of thousands in flak alone, sized for an operational force that had stopped growing. The surplus was structural, and everyone in the armed forces' high command could see it. They were also the best-conditioned surplus manpower left in Germany. Already in uniform, already fed, already paid for. And they belonged to Hermann Göring. Göring's answer was that his men would be contaminated. That is close to the literal wording. He objected that the fine National Socialist attitudes of Luftwaffe personnel would be degraded by an army he considered reactionary. An army that still kept chaplains on its establishment and still had officers whose professional formation had happened under the Kaiser. He had described his paratroopers as political soldiers. He meant it as a category, and he did not intend to hand that category over to men he thought were still fighting the last war with the old country's manners. That was the reason he gave. There was a second one: he did not. Handing his ground personnel to the army would have been an admission, in the only currency the Nazi state actually traded in, that the Luftwaffe no longer needed them. which meant conceding that the flying service was shrinking into its own ground staff. Göring had promised in 1939 that no enemy aircraft would cross the Reich, and by the autumn of 1942, the British were over the Ruhr at night, and his prestige was running on credit. A man in that position does not volunteer evidence against himself. There is a smaller absurdity inside the ideological objection. The Luftwaffe kept no chaplains of its own. It had never established a chaplaincy, so when its men wanted one, they borrowed from the army Göring had just called reactionary, or found a parish priest. So he made a counter-offer, and the counter-offer is the part of this story that never quite fits into a sentence. He would raise the infantry himself. New divisions, formed from Luftwaffe personnel, equipped by the Luftwaffe, commanded by Luftwaffe officers, and answerable to him. 200,000 men, and every one of them still his. Hitler approved it in October 1942. 22 divisions were authorized and 21 were actually raised. Each was built at roughly 12 to 13,000 men, about two-thirds the strength of a standard army infantry division, because the equipment to fill them out did not exist. They were called Luftwaffe field divisions. They were given basic weapons, minimal infantry training, and the blue-grey Luftwaffe uniform, which marked them out from the units on either side of them. Germany had just created a third ground army in the same winter its first one stopped being able to replace its losses. The second had been standing there since before the war. The Waffen-SS reached the recruits before the army was allowed to. The mechanism was simple, and it was agreed in writing. The SS could take volunteers roughly a year before the army was permitted to conscript the same age class, which meant that by the time the army's draft boards reached a cohort, the SS recruiters had already been through it. Wilhelm Keitel allocated Himmler's divisions a quota of 24,000 18-year-olds, and the recruiting organization under Gottlob Berger went past it and kept going, on the reasoning that men accepted were men in hand regardless of what the paperwork said. Then came the year the argument was settled in the open. For the next class, Keitel offered 15,000 and Berger demanded 26,000, and in November 1942, Hitler gave Berger the full number. The chief of the armed forces high command set a figure, and the head of SS recruitment had it overturned by going over his head at the exact moment the army could not fill its own divisions. Then the domestic pool closed. Croatia had signed in 1941, Romania followed in May 1943, Hungary was brought into line the year after, each of them permitting the Waffen-SS to take their German minorities. The word volunteer became a legal fiction, and then stopped being a fiction anyone bothered to maintain. The army's response tells you what kind of competition this had become. By the summer of 1943, the army had begun using the same recruiting methods it had spent 3 years objecting to, at larger scale because the methods worked and the alternative was losing. The advantage was written into the establishment tables. The German-manned SS divisions of the first wave were authorized at roughly 20,000 men against roughly 16,500 for an army division, about a fifth larger with substantially more motor transport. The foreign legions raised later were smaller and chronically understrength, and the gap between the two halves of the Waffen-SS is its own story. The clearest evidence sits in the paperwork rather than in any battle. When Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf were rebuilt in 1942, each was authorized a full regiment of tanks instead of a battalion. On paper, they were Panzer Grenadier divisions. In organization, they were full panzer divisions carrying a lesser name. Here is the part the Army's own memoirs are careful about, because it does not help them. The SS Panzer Corps earned that allocation at Kharkov, and it earned it by disobeying Hitler. In February 1943, the 40th Army closed from the north, the 69th from the east, the 3rd Tank Army from the south, and part of the 6th Army pressed the southern flank behind it, narrowing Hausser's corridor out to about a mile. He was under a personal order from Hitler to hold Kharkov to the last man. He evacuated it anyway on his own authority. A month later, he took it back. An army general who ignored a hold to the last man order in the winter after Stalingrad could expect to be relieved. Hausser kept his corps and led it at Kursk 5 months later. Concentrating your best equipment in the formations most likely to survive contact is one of the few defensible things about the whole arrangement. The problem was never that the Waffen-SS was given priority. The problem was that nobody in Germany had the authority to decide whether the priority was correct. If you want history that takes the paperwork seriously, hit subscribe. What follows is the part almost nobody covers. Germany noticed this problem at the time and built a body to fix it. That body lasted 8 months. In January 1943, with the 6th Army still surrounded at Stalingrad, Hitler agreed to a committee meant to fix exactly the problem this video is about. 3 men: Hans Heinrich Lammers for the Reich Chancellery, Martin Bormann for the party, Wilhelm Keitel for the Armed Forces High Command. Their job was to centralize wartime mobilization and issue directives across the whole war effort without every decision traveling to Hitler personally. On paper, it was the missing piece. Somewhere above the 3 armies there would finally be a body that could look at all of them at once and say where the men went. It met 11 times between January and August, and then it was finished. It was finished because Joseph Goebbels, Albert Speer, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler had all been left off it, and all 4 worked to bring it down. Give them their due on motive. Goebbels and Speer thought the committee too slow and wanted a single empowered plenipotentiary for total war instead, while Göring and Himmler simply wanted nobody standing above them. These were men who agreed on almost nothing and spent the war undermining each other in every other arena. The one thing they cooperated on was killing the body that would have held authority over their allocations. Goebbels did eventually get his plenipotentiary. The appointment came in late July 1944, days after the bomb went off under Hitler's map table. Look at what the intervening 18 months left in place. Albert Speer, the man history files as the coordinator of the German war economy, held no formal control over naval armaments until the autumn of 1943, and none over Luftwaffe armaments until 1944. The coordinator did not control the procurement of 2 of the 3 services. Every dispute over men and equipment ended in the same place. It went to Hitler. When one man settles every claim out of personal judgment, what decides the outcome is access, who is in the room that week, and who he had reason to trust that month. The army did not have the least access. Hitler had made himself its commander-in-chief in December 1941 and was briefed on it daily. What it had least of was trust. He had suspected its officer corps since the Blomberg and Fritsch affair purged its leadership in 1938, and after Stalingrad it became the institution he associated with failure. It also happened to be the one doing the fighting. The Soviets worked out what the Luftwaffe field divisions were and began aiming at them. A sector held by men in blue-grey uniforms with officers who had never commanded infantry and none of the anti-tank guns a regular division carried is an entry point, and Soviet reconnaissance learned to mark them on the map. The 2nd Luftwaffe Field Division is the clearest case. Badly mauled in its first winter, it held a stretch of line for most of a year and then came apart at Nivelle on the 6th of October 1943 under the opening assault, leaving a gap between 2 army groups and most of its heavy weapons behind. None of that was the fault of the men in those uniforms. Luftwaffe recruitment standards had been high and the personnel Göring kept were fit, technically trained and young. They were good material, put into a job nobody had prepared them for, holding frontage sized for a division with the weapons of a brigade. The bill came due in the Donbas. In August 1943, the German southern wing was holding the industrial basin of eastern Ukraine with the 6th Army, rebuilt after its destruction at Stalingrad, and the 1st Panzer Army beside it. Luftwaffe field divisions were in the order of battle for both, and replacements had not kept pace with losses. The mobile reserve was gone. In July, the Soviets had attacked that same ground at the Meuse River and been thrown back by a counterstroke built around 5 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions, Das Reich and Totenkopf among them. Within weeks, those formations had gone north to Kharkov. The Leibstandarte went further than north. It was pulled off the Eastern Front entirely and sent to Italy to disarm the Italian army and guard against an ally changing sides, reaching the plain of the Po on the 8th of August. And it went without its tanks. Its heavy equipment was stripped before departure and handed to Das Reich and Totenkopf. Germany sent the men 1,500 miles to police a wavering ally and left the armor behind to do the fighting it had been built for. The Soviet offensive into the Donbas opened on the 13th of August, over 1 million men against roughly 400,000. By the end of the month, the 6th Army was close to collapse and the 29th Corps was nearly cut off on the coast near Taganrog. The pocket was evacuated under artillery fire on the 31st. The 15th Luftwaffe Field Division came out of it with heavy casualties. Göring had raised that division in the winter of 1942 out of men the army had asked for. 9 months later, it was being pulled out of a pocket in the Donbas. By the 22nd of September, the German southern wing had been driven back nearly 200 miles onto an unfinished line along the Dnieper, and the industrial region was lost for good. The Red Army earned that ground. 2 fronts under Fyodor Tolbukin and Rodion Malinovsky ran an offensive that would have been hard to stop at full strength. This wing had been hollowed out by 3 decisions taken in Berlin across the previous 11 months before the first shell landed. Göring's decision from October was standing in the line. Himmler's recruiting priority was one of the reasons the replacements behind it were thin. And Hitler's decision to send his best division to police an ally put the reserve that had saved that exact ground in July on the other side of Europe. 6 weeks later, the army finally got those men back. By the autumn of 1943, even the Luftwaffe had stopped defending the experiment, and what happened to the survivors shows the system working exactly as designed. One proposal was to convert the divisions into specialist assault units. Another was to break them up as a recruiting pool for the airborne arm. Erich von Manstein put the army's case, dissolve them into regular divisions as replacements, which is what the army had asked for in the first place, 14 months and tens of thousands of casualties earlier. Hitler decided for the army. On the 1st of November 1943, the surviving Luftwaffe field divisions passed to army control. The army took them and immediately replaced their officers wholesale, correct militarily and unmistakably a message. The Luftwaffe replied by holding back its specialists and moving them into parachute and anti-aircraft formations where the army could not reach them. By the summer of 1944, with the front collapsing in both directions, the Luftwaffe was transferring personnel to the army anyway. Germany paid for the same men twice and got them back as casualties. The grievance ran deep enough that the army officers' July 1944 plan to seize the state included dissolving the Waffen-SS into Army Command, arresting any senior SS officer who objected. And it did not stop when the war did. Within months of the surrender, army officers in Allied captivity were already drafting the argument that the army had been a national institution betrayed by a criminal leadership. 10 years after that, when West Germany built a new army, the screening committee barred every Waffen-SS general and colonel outright, and two of them, Felix Steiner and Herbert Giller, protested publicly. The argument was still being adjudicated in the mid-1950s by a committee in a country that no longer contained the state either side had been fighting for. Germany built its extra armies on purpose, for reasons that had nothing to do with the war. A dictatorship resting on one man's authority tends to produce a parallel army, because the ruler needs troops who answer to him rather than to a general staff that expects to outlast him. Hitler built that army in the SS. Göring's was a different animal, an empire defended by a man who could not afford to look smaller, and Hitler let him keep it because the competition kept all of them dependent on him. Nobody below Hitler could settle these disputes because the disputes were how he ruled. The army a country fields ends up shaped like the politics that built it, and Germany's politics could not produce one army. So which is it? An avoidable mistake or the price of the regime that built the German army? Drop your answer below. Subscribe if this changed how you look at what actually breaks an army from the inside. Thanks for watching.